that today because I don't know if everybody knows, but for those of you who've been in the industry for a while, this isn't a new discussion. Back in 2013, I don't know if anybody remembers those stolen copper loads. That was a very popular thing. Copper loads are getting stolen all over the country. And this rule was created where if you were a carrier, you had to have one roadside inspection in the past 2 years before brokers and shippers would load you. And it became a popular rule in the industry. And at one point, 90% of the brokers and shippers had this rule in place. But similar to most vetting rules, there's a pendulum that swings back and forth depending on capacity. So when there are less trucks available, we tend to go a little loosey-goosey on these rules, and that's fine. Each company gets to decide what to do. And this is one that's commonly made exceptions for. So today, on today's discussion, we're going to talk about why have this inspection rule, why is it important, what does it mean, and then also what are the exceptions? Are there any exceptions allowed? Should you investigate further? Should you call the carrier? There's so much good stuff to talk about. And again, you guys, for those of you out there who are like, oh my God, I'm not doing it right. No, you can do whatever you want. There's nothing wrong with hiring a carrier without inspections. There's nothing wrong with hiring one with inspections. Do what you want and what's best for your company, your freight, your customers, and your job. But this is an important discussion because a lot of people, their jobs depend on the freight not getting stolen, not getting damaged, and then having to explain to your customer why you picked a certain customer or carrier, or having to explain why to your boss why you picked that certain carrier. I'm going to introduce my guest in just a minute, but I want to tell you, I want to start doing these episodes every week or every other week, if possible, where we analyze these rules of vetting a carrier and we talk about them. It's a great educational piece, but in an attempt to do this, I have found that sometimes people get pissed off. So I want to give you guys a little bit of a story before we dive into our experts today, and so you have some back history. There's this new software being released at Lean Tech's, or Lean Tech, Lean Software, Lean Marketing, Lean Staffing, whatever you want to call it, Lean Group. They have this big mastermind event in Vegas next week. And there's a big beta release of a new technology that's all algorithms and data science, and they do all the work for you, and they pick the carrier. And so I got beta access, and I'm playing with this software, and I see a carrier that looked like it would be a great carrier, but it had a giant F. So I asked the Freightwaves people to show the video first for carrier assurance benefit, and then can you please show the screen of the carrier video? Ooh, good video. Okay, so here you see, because I saw this, and I want you guys to put yourselves in my shoes. I saw this as Tennessee Transportation Resources. It doesn't even matter who it is, but it had an F, and I'm like, what is this? 10 trucks? What does it say? Let me see. 17 years of authority. And I'm like, why is this an F? And then, you can still hire an F carrier on this platform. They just tell you to give it shipments valued less than 50,000, use customers for flexible appointments, use short haul, easy dry van shipments. So then I'm looking down at their DOT performance, and I notice it says 0 inspections. So I thought this was interesting, and I started looking more into the carrier, because usually a carrier with 17 years of authority and 10 trucks has an inspection by now. So I made this LinkedIn post. I'm like, let's get everybody's opinion. Maybe there's something else going on here. And here it is. Thank you, Freightwaves people. It said, would you hire this carrier? Authority since 2005. Green check mark. Claims to have 10 trucks. Green check mark. Claims to have 10 drivers. Green check mark. Chattanooga base. Woohoo. Check mark. It says, come on. We all love Chattanooga. Come on, you guys. Y'all love Chattanooga. It says, no inspections with a red X. And then it says website too with a check mark. And then you can flip over and you can see right from the DOT website that they have 0 inspections. So I wanted people to tell me, what exceptions would you make for this? Would you hire this carrier? And it was such an interesting discussion. And for anybody who wants access to that software, I forgot to tell you that it will be open for beta. People can go to the website and they can get access to it and test it out and do whatever they want by next Friday at After Lean's event in Las Vegas. So here's what I want to do. I want to flip to our guests. I want to start with Chris, because Chris Baker is one of my best friends. I love him forever. To heaven, to hell, I will follow you, Chris. He's with Semgistics. He is an analyst. He looks at carriers. It is his sole job. He looks at carriers day in and day out. And everything he says today is not a representation of Semgistics. So we're going to call this Chris's world because, every company's different what they should do. And everything is always different. So Chris will probably speak generally. But Chris, could you explain to us, in the world of logistics, and let's imagine you have Chris's Logistics or whatever you want to call your company, tell us why this rule is important about zero inspections. Teach us a little bit for those people who are like, what is going on this show?
Yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be back. Hello to all the other guests.
I know, I'm so happy to see your face.
I know. I'm so happy to be here. So yeah, this rule. Okay, so a little context. I come from healthcare before I came into the logistics industry, and when I first came across carriers and started vetting them, I would see carriers with like a lot of inspections, and I'm like, whoa, like. What is causing them to have a target on their backs with the FMCSA? And then, of course, I started looking at things like fleet size, because the more trucks that you have on the road, the more inspections you're going to have. And that's just kind of the way it is because it's an accessibility thing. So, when I did a little bit of a deeper investigation, and I think I've chatted with you about this in my earlier part of my career in the logistics industry, really the red flag, because when you get your DOT certification or when you get your authority, you're supposed to have an inspection. And, it was explained that, actually having no inspections is a little bit more of a red flag. That can indicate a few things, that can, of course, indicate that maybe the FMCSA hasn't come out to that particular carrier to do an inspection. Of course, we have FMCSA safety ratings of conditional that are going on 20 years now that haven't been updated or re-inspected. So a lot of the times it involves the bandwidth of the government as to whether or not they can, go out and inspect the carrier, but also it can indicate something like, like an involuntary revocation. Maybe the carrier had been in business 17 years, they were involuntarily revoked, they were able to be made conditional and they reinstated their authority, but now their authority looks like they're a month old with no inspections. So those scenarios can arise. And then, of course, you do have those instances where it is truly fraudulent, where the carrier, we have those instances where carriers will abandon their MC after fraudulent activity, and they will reinstate with another MC. And so that is probably the thing that we're mainly on the lookout for, is the latter, the last scenario. But yeah, it's kind of what I've gathered in terms of this rule over my career. Right? Yeah, I don't know if that covers it all.
Yeah, that's what I've gathered too. No, it does. It's very interesting, and I think that and I'd ask the Freewaves people, and I apologize if I can't remember. There's an image I had from Ingrid. I loved her post. Ingrid is so smart. She's a truck driver. She's owned her business for years and years and years. She's on Freewaves all the time. She said, I wanted to throw something from the carrier driver side about inspections. Drivers can't request or volunteer for inspections at any weight station, traffic stop, or scale. I think she meant they can. We are at the judgment of the officers. Oh, maybe they can't. That's interesting. So getting inspections are honestly not a reason to vet a carrier. Carriers and drivers have no control over how many we do and we don't have on file. I look at it like this. After they put with no voluntary system in force, I shouldn't be judged on how many inspections I have. It was interesting to hear Ingrid's thoughts on this. I will tell you from a data perspective, when I asked carriers, because they don't use people, they use all data and science, they said that when you have, and then why that carrier got that specific F was when you have, it was an outlier on the bell curve. So normal carriers of that size, when compared to its peers, should have had a certain amount of inspections. So this one would be abnormal. But in general, to us, it usually indicates that maybe you're not running long hauls. Maybe you're not getting those inspections as you should. There's so many variables here. So I want to ask Jeff Carr, who's also a good friend of mine, who has worked at a trucking company, and now he is the CEO of a risk management company. Jeff, thank you for joining us. And could you give us your insights when you saw my post? You saw this carrier, no inspections. What were some of your thoughts?
Thanks for having me. And I apologize, my internet is not the greatest. I'm in rural Illinois, and I've got 2 kids at home as well. So if I drop off, I apologize.
Don't worry about it. Just so you know, I freeze up. Things go out all the time.
So this, 17 years, and you see no inspections. It certainly raises a red flag, but you also have to look a little deeper. And so, it causes for research. And in this case, I went and looked at the SMS for this carrier, just like you did. And then I looked at the registration information and kind of went down that rabbit hole of who really owns this authority. And it's another trucking company, right? And this is a separate office, and they keep separate operating authorities. And it could be for a myriad of reasons. So, I guess my point behind this is that it was more about why do they have it? And I think that's the deeper question, because in this carrier's website, the address for this second authority that you brought up with no inspections was actually a second terminal of theirs. So it could be as simple as a separation of liability. Maybe they keep that second authority and they run 1 load a year under it, or they run some local freight in that area where they don't have inspections. So it's not as not as suspect sometimes as meets the eye. It just warrants that deeper question as to why they're doing it.
I love that point, and I think you really bring a lot of information into the situation. I want to ask Drew. Drew has been in risk management for a long time as well. He is head of risk management for his company. But Drew, do you consider because we hear this a lot, right? The sister entity thing. And actually, I want to show Drew's response, because somebody named Justin Austin made a comment on this post, and I thought it was interesting, and we'll see if the Freight Waves people can find it. It's kind of a good find. But I remember him saying, I would call, and at first I was like, who is Eric Story? I would call Eric Story and confirm it's a related entity to Story Trucking out of Alabama. Travelers is the Alabama insurance under both entities as well. Looks like they've become active on blah, blah, blah. As long as it's a related entity, that's what it looks like. I would hire this motor carrier. And I thought it was so interesting. I'm like, these people are so smart that they would go and investigate. And you did too, Jeff. And but here's the thing is that, Drew, you had an interesting response. And then I was like, we got to get Drew on to talk about this. Justin Austin, I would not call Eric Story. I would, however, email their insurance agent for confirmation. Brilliant. If the agent responds saying, call Eric Story, I will then tell you that, that's all you need to know. It's basically what you said. As I stated in my original comment, I would not spend a lot of time on this one. Drew, tell me what your thoughts were here, because I did see a lot of discussion about sister companies and this over here and this DOT number over here, and they're related to this and they're related to that, and my head wanted to go boom. So what do you think about all that?
Looked at is like he did. I looked at the company that was advertised in Tennessee. I looked at their website that you had posted at the very bottom, and I saw immediately there was a different company. My past experience has told me that at that point, you probably got some fraud going on. There's probably some double brokering going on, et cetera. And I do understand that what the other driver said about, it's out of their control when it comes to inspections. But I thought about it a little bit more, and I contacted a colleague of mine that I hadn't spoke with in about a year. And he runs a brokerage operation, and he told me an interesting story. And it went like this. About a year ago, motor carrier contacted them, wanted to move some loads for them, and they did not have any inspections done. They went ahead and allowed them to do it. And in turn, everything went well for about 7 months. And finally, the original broker was contacted by a factory company. And what they found out is that the trucking company that they were giving the loads to, which again were 2 entities, same insurance company, they were actually double brokering the loads at a $2,000 increase. They weren't paying the factory company. They weren't paying the drivers. The factory company, about 7 months into it, figured it out, contacted the original broker, demanded payment. Drivers did the same thing. It became a legal issue. Attorneys had to get involved. The shipper was completely upset about it. And so, and I've seen this over and over again. Anytime there's the situation that we're speaking of, where you have, two trucking companies, same owner, typically they're doing exactly what I just said. I've seen it over and over again. In addition to that, I would say to everyone, in those situations, if a vehicle accident occurs and someone's injured or God forbid killed, you have a different set of issues. And so I just feel like that when it comes to a motor carrier not having any inspections and being in business for that long, to me, it's problematic. I wouldn't use them.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I love your points. I really, really love your points. What a great group. I'm going to keep bringing you guys to analyze these carriers because it's not about the carrier, whatever their name is. We don't care about that. And if you are the carrier and you're watching this and you're really angry and you're like, fuck Cassandra, she's a jerk. I'm going to jump her in the alley when she gets out of the freight waves. I want you to know something very important. And I only say this because I saw Eric Story's comment on my post. I think we should probably show that comment just so we can get some better insight because I didn't know who Eric Story was at first. I was like, I don't even understand. It's not the same name as whatever the DOT number is I posted. But it says, thanks, Brendan and Stephen, for paying attention. Don't know who they are. Maybe his brothers. As a second-generation trucker with 50 years in business, we also like to point out the bad guys. Problem is we are not one. The problem is threads like these cause damage to the ones that are trying to do it right. So, of course, I invited Eric on to our show. And his seat is still sitting there empty because I wanted to hear the story. And I think a lot of people find that calling the carriers are helpful and looking into details. And everybody gets to decide what they want to do. But I want carriers out there who get angry when they hear all this. These are your customers. All those comments and the people here talking, they're your customers. And this is what they think when they see your data. Out of 375,000 potential carriers for long haul shipments, this is what they think when it's your data. So they're not being jerks and trying to be personal. They truly are thinking like, oh, what do I do with this data? Because they're playing a guessing game. And at the end of the day, their butts are in the seat if something goes wrong, right? So let me see. Let me go to our channel because it's been very active over here we're on LinkedIn, we're on FreightWaves TV, we're on YouTube, but it's been pretty active over here. And I want to point out a couple comments. John Radvansky, John is one of my buddies. He says, let's see, is it possible that a small carrier that maintains its fleets in tip-top condition, sparkling clean, well-maintained, will not catch the eye of inspectors? And I think John has asked an excellent question. We'll see what some of our guests say in just a second. Randy Hudson says, I know a carrier in California that just started keeping his trucks local under one MC and started another one for long haul due to the number of trucks that MC and his insurance rates. That's interesting. And then Matt Fink, who I love Matt Fink. He says, Drew, just too much risk and no upside. What's the upside of accepting this much risk? Move on, work harder, find less risky carriers. That's what my thoughts are too if my butt is in the hot seat for something getting stolen or damaged. So this isn't personal, folks. This is this is a business. So let's go back to Chris, if he's still around, if he still wants to analyze this for us. And Chris, I have a question for you. What do you do? Are there any exceptions that people in the industry in general, nothing to do with your company, but in Chris brokerage or in our logistics world, are there any exceptions that are made for these situations where a carrier has, lengthy authority and you're gonna hire them for a shipment from California to Illinois or something like that? Are there any exceptions to the no inspections rules?
Yeah, and I think you already know my answer to this, but what I'm going to say is I really think that depends upon your risk threshold as a business, how much risk you're able to take on, and kind of the operational circumstance. I think one of the hardest challenges for, did I cut out?
I have no idea. I would just keep going.
Okay,
There's
perfect.
always something technical going on when I'm involved.
Yeah, no worries.
It's a great picture of you too. Love the hair.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, but I would say that, it really just depends on your risk threshold as a company and, how much you're able to take on and kind of the operational circumstance. I think, one of the challenges for what we do is trying to mitigate risk and also find, an operational compromise in a volatile carrier market. You know what I mean? So I think that really just depends. I do think that, to the gentleman's point, both of the gentlemen joining us, I think that they have an excellent point. Carriers do this of one of two reasons: either to separate liability or to avoid it altogether. I think that the scenario is typically one or the other. And so, doing kind of that deep dive and really determining, and I always say Nancy Drewing it, but really Nancy Drewing your way into the situation, figuring out, all right, what are all the variables at play? Have we spoken with the carrier? Have we spoken with the insurance? I think going to the insurance is a really good, objective, third-party telltale sign as to whether or not a carrier is authentic or not. And that's kind of, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that, there are scenarios, operational scenarios. And I think that it really just depends on the company and the circumstance and the lane and the commodity and all of these things, the potential risk in that. So that's kind of my answer, I guess, in that regard.
I love it. You bring up some great points. I want to point out something about the sister companies before I go to Jeff. I have a great question for Jeff, but I want to point something out. When we start talking about another MC or most importantly, DOT number, and another MC number, and Drew kind of brought this up in 5 different ways, but very directly I want to be, because he was being nice. When we call you, a broker or shipper calls a carrier and asks questions about your DOT number, which was very nice of them to call because most of them don't. And you say, oh, my sister entity over here is actually who will run the shipment. That's why we don't have any inspections. Or this over here, over here, over here. That's fine. But the broker or the shipper needs to actually run an analysis on that specific DOT number that's going to be on the side of the door. That's the most important thing. Otherwise, you are looking at a double brokering. So you've got a broker who gives it to a carrier who brokers it to another MC number. That's the brokering, the doubling part. So that's the part that everybody gets angry about. So it's okay if you have that DOT number of your sister company and they're not ready yet to be running shipments, but you have to, by federal law, by the way, be very clear to your customer who is running that load. If you are not, you are in violation of federal law. People say sister companies and interlining and all this other crap. No, switching the numbers is where we have a problem without telling us. That's all. Jeff, do carriers avoid inspections? And does anybody know? Can you I would be I need an inspection. I'm driving around looking for a way to get an inspection if I was a new carrier. Inspect me.
So I've got a couple of different points here. The first one is the last carrier that I worked for actually had 2 operating authorities, and it was to separate our hazardous materials shipments from our non-hazardous shipments. So it was a big separation of liability there. But we would get that question all the time too. Why do you have 2 operating authorities? And so as long as you've got a good story and you can explain it and you've got documentation to prove all of it, it does kind of ease people's minds a little bit, like you guys were saying. But to answer your other question, yes, people dodge inspections all the time. It's an unfortunate thing that happens, and you hear it quite a bit, but drivers do it for a myriad of reasons, and none of them are really a good thing. But it does happen, unfortunately, in the industry a lot more than it should. And to answer your question, yes, some people do want to get inspections, and they want those clean inspections. The other side of that is you go through an inspection and you're confident that it's going to be clean, and then it's not. And so then you're disappointed. But I guess to answer your question, yes, people do it all the time. I've seen it. You try to coach people not to do it. Sometimes they still do it anyway because they have their reasons, and it's rather unfortunate.
Yeah. What do you think? Do you think exceptions for this 0 inspection rule? Do you think are there any exceptions? Because I'm gonna come right out and say I don't like making exceptions. However, this is actually I'll let you answer this first.
Let me pose this to you. Have you ever heard of a company called LaserSpot? LaserSpot is a company that just does, so there's a couple of these companies, and basically all they do is they work on your yard and they move your trailers in and out of docks, right? Amazon used to use them quite a bit. There's a couple other ones. There's a couple other of these companies. This is the first one that comes to mind because I know some of the folks over there. But if they cross a public road, so they take a trailer from the dock to a marshaling yard and it goes across a public road, they're required to have operating authority. They're not going to get an inspection moving from the dock, crossing the road to a marshaling yard. Now, let's say 10 years down the road, Laser Spot or whoever this carrier is that does this as a primary means of business gets acquired or decides to expand into over-the-road trucking. And they need to do that by getting brokered loads. And they've been in business for 15 years and they have no inspections. They're a legitimate carrier. They've got a good business, but now they're just branching out. So now they're in the same boat that this Tennessee Transportation Resources.
But technically, Jeff, they don't have experience running long hauls. So I would treat them the same I would treat any brand new carrier. I'd be like, you don't have experience running long hauls. We got to wait and make sure you have trucks first. And then I want to make sure that like you've done okay for long hauls because my ass is on the line, right? Because if you're just going across the road, you probably just have intrastate authority. You don't actually have interstates. You probably never came on my radar, right, Jeff?
Well, you would. I mean, if you have operations in multiple states, you would have interstate authority. Or if you're touching freight that started in another. Well, no, it's not necessarily because you need to have interstate operating authority anyway, because you're moving freight that originated outside of the state that you're moving it in. You're operating in interstate commerce. Am I wrong?
Your first example was they were crossing a street, and then they wanted long hauls.
Well, no, and you're absolutely right. But let's look at their type of authority is a different question, right? Because they're having to move freight that's interstate commerce from one point to another, which would require interstate operating authority.
And then if you actually move it for over 2 years, you should probably have an inspection by then, according to statistics and data. By the way, these aren't opinions, right? At least the tool I was using is in statistics and data. So that's where we're coming from. I would say that I understand if you're going to hire the carrier for short hauls. Chris, how would you? Oh no, actually, let's do Drew first. Drew, what are your thoughts about hiring these carriers when it comes to doing a long haul? If they tell you, hey, we've been doing like short hauls lately, and but we're good. We have the trucks. I can prove to you. I can take pictures of the DOT number and send it to you, Drew.
I wouldn't do it. When I was a safety director, and we would have drivers wanting to be hired, and they didn't have any experience driving in snow and ice, I wouldn't bring them on. But when it comes to, say, for instance, the motor carriers that have zero inspections, I would agree with Chris in respects to what is your risk management, threshold in respects to what you're willing to, take on. With that being said, I do feel like that there's this thing called too much due diligence, right? And so you have to look at it from this point of view. What's your timeline for hiring this carrier? Do you have 10 minutes to do it? Do you have an hour to do it? Are there other carriers that are that you could pick from? Because if they're not, and you go down the road of digging, and all you're finding is things that don't look good, and you hire that carrier anyway because you don't have any options, I don't think you've done yourself any favors.
Yep. I couldn't agree more. Before I get Chris's, I have a great question for you, Chris. You will love this question. But before I do that, I want to tell you what some of the comments are saying. Steve Perez has been on one of my most popular shows. I love Steve Perez. He says new carriers have no DOT inspections. It's the one that have over 24 months or more that bring concerns to a broker. Thank you, Steve. I should have illuminated that the carrier might be double brokering or something like that. It's not 100%, but Steve says it's his viewpoint. So interestingly, Adkis Transport says, are you guys saying that carriers should just go by a weigh station and request for a DOT inspection just to show that they're road safe? Most brokers don't recognize the DOT annual inspection. Yeah, we don't recognize. No way. That's stupid. No. But asking for a road safe inspection, if that's what my customers want, I probably do it. But not my opinion. Jason, we call him, it's Zaleski, but Jason, I always fuck up your last name, so I call you Jay-Z. The famous Jay-Z says that is exactly what they should do. Thank you, JC. If they are a safe carrier, they have nothing to worry about, and clean inspections are a good thing. Yes, don't you hear your customers just want one fucking inspection in 2 years? Just one, you guys. All right, so Steve Press says, I'm crossing the border, DOT gives inspections, and then Tex DOT does it, and then a scale house, 40 minutes from the border, 3 inspections per day. Thank you, Steve. Damn. So do expect DOT carrier to get inspections, especially after a few months. It doesn't feel good to book a carrier that has 0 inspections, especially if they drive through Texas. I'm loving this chatter going on. You guys are so smart. Okay, Chris, on one of these posts, and then we're going to wrap this conversation up. We're going to finalize with Chris. Chris, there was a post about a chameleon carrier on LinkedIn. And let's see if FreightWaves can find it. They're ready to punch me by the end of this, I'm sure. It's Friday afternoon. They've had a long week, and they're like, what is Cassandra doing? She's half drunk on this show, and she's making us show 18 different images. But the chameleon carrier is right. Logan Hooks. He says, that's because all their inspections were under chameleons that are in Alabama. Now, many people were scratching their heads on this statement. What is going on here? What the hell is a chameleon carrier, Chris?
Okay, so if he's talking about what I think he's talking about, I immediately thought of like Bakersfield, Fresno, Chicago, but obviously, yeah, you know what I'm talking. You know what I'm talking about. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Chameleon carriers, yes. Obviously, they're carriers that operate in the most of the time the same city or same cluster cities. It's like a carrier network essentially, and they're all kind of involved in the same fraudulent material. I see it, fraudulent behavior. I see it all the time, especially with carriers when we find double brokering situations. Once again, in like Fresno, Bakersfield, that's probably the one that I see it the most. But yeah, it makes it really easy when they're all interconnected, especially when they work in cluster cities, to change the information when they recycle these MCs, to change it slightly to make it appear as though nothing fraudulent's going on, make the fraud a little bit easier, or sorry, harder to find, less easy to identify. But yeah, I mean, this is a valid point. I think also depends on where the carrier's out of, and where the associating entities are out of. Sometimes you can find a whole web of carriers just by doing a deep dive to associated MCs, for some of these carriers who are using fraudulent, MCs or double brokering.
So you can hear from Chris's explanation, right? I don't think this is a chameleon carrier. Drew was talking about this. Jeff was talking about this too, which was, there's another carrier who seems to be associated with this. It just doesn't, it looks like a good carrier that's based out of whatever, and they have other things going on. So, but it's a great example to understand where people's headspace are. They're trying to avoid fraud. So this carrier is probably not a chameleon carrier, but chameleon carriers are so... it will ruin your business if one grabs you unaware. It's crazy. Carrier Sure wanted a story to know that they have their DOT number has been rated statistically as well. If FreightWaves has a chance, if they could show it. I think they were rated well, having good drivers and all that jazz. So I'm sure if you talk to Story, they would tell you, hey, this DOT number over here we use for blah, but use our main DOT number that we've been using for 50 years and everyone loves it. Let's see, 40 years of authority. They've got good data. This would make Chris, Drew, and Jeff very happy right here. This is a good, solid carrier. Use that DOT number. Just ignore the other one. That's probably what they're going to tell you when you talk to them. But who knows? Guys, this is just, we're not trying to be assholes. Just DOT numbers.
I have a really quick question for both the other guests. I wanted to ask really quick. So when we're doing a deep dive on these carriers for these particular situations, is it appropriate to, or is it too much risk to take on to ask the carrier for their ISS score?
Ooh. That's a good question. My personal opinion, I think it goes back to what Drew had said is, digging too deep might get you in a situation where you're not doing yourself any favors.
Right.
It's certainly not. But I mean, the one thing that I would say is if you're going to ask for the ISS score, ask for the ISS score for a certain reason. So maybe you're saying, hey, you have 2 alerts. What's your ISS score? Or you have 1 alert, or your history shows you've had alerts in the past. What's your ISS score? I wouldn't just arbitrarily ask for it. And honestly, some carriers may be proud enough to just give it to you and just say, hey, our ISS score is 28 or 25 or 30. Those are sometimes the better carriers that you want to deal with as well. But I think it depends on the situation. But I think it does go back to Drew's point, where it's one of those things where you might not be doing yourself any favors and get yourself into a situation where you ask a carrier that's a good partner of yours, that has been a partner of yours for a long time, and they have an ISS score of 95, and now you're in a situation where you know about it, and now there's a terrible collision where you now have to defend yourself as to why you used that carrier with an ISS score of 95 that you knew about.
That makes total sense.
God. Yeah, it was perfectly said. Hey, Chris, I think you knew the answer to that question when you asked that. I want to say one more thing. Yeah, I feel like he was like really, that was a beautiful question. So I want to wrap up our show with a beautiful comment from Chandler Megan, who is Next Exit Logistics based out of Dallas. And don't worry about Next Exit. They are still up and operating full force. He does all crazy shipments. It's really cool. You should check out their website. But they are ready for the freeze or whatever's going on in Dallas. Poor Dallas. Actually, no, I don't feel bad for Dallas because weather's shit in other areas of the country. So, Dallas, you can put up a little cold. Okay, he says some of our carriers purposely haul shipments during the road check safety blitz because they're hoping to get an inspection, and the broker shippers are prepared for road check delays. That is so smart. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you to my beautiful, wonderful, experienced, amazing guests. Please come back. We're going to do this more often because there are other parts of vetting a carrier that are so interesting. And there's so many good carriers out there, and it's really gray. There's no black and white rules. It's a hard area to deal with. Thank you very, very much. And thank you to FreightWaves for putting up with me and all my images and craziness. I really appreciate it. Have a great Friday.